Over last year, a good friend of mine hiked through the entire coastal path of the United Kingdom. Now, that might sound like a lovely coastal walk, but it was actually the same distance that you'd need to walk all the way to China. It took him not just a year, but a year and a month to complete the whole thing, and that was basically just hiking and camping every single day. And you might also want to note that the UK is not famous for its year-round pleasant weather. I joined him for 1 week of that in the wilds of the Scottish West Coast, where there was actually no path at all, and that was mainly a week of just getting stuck in bogs, crawling into our camp 5 hours later than we'd planned in the wee hours of the morning, and usually just completely soaked. Now, I'm someone who runs ultramarathons, and those are probably the only slightly comparable time I've had in terms of my levels of complete exhaustion and just adrenaline running through me. Like, my body went into panic mode like the entire week I spent with him. And perhaps another comparison is the fact that I just spent 3 months in Nepal climbing mountains, which was less difficult than hiking with my friend Jamie around the UK, which sounds absurd, but it's true. Anyway, the question that I couldn't shake whilst I was doing this was, how are some people able to deal with just the relentless amount of setbacks and difficulties every day and keep going in the face of so much difficulty over so long and doing something so exhausting as the hike that Jamie did for a whole year? Because I've known for a long time that simply relying on internal motivation for any project or habit will quickly run out. Internal motivation and willpower only is actually a bit of a recipe for failure, even though it's a very good source to start with. So I was pleased to dig much deeper into this for this episode and find some answers. Hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Podcast. I am Sam Webster Harris. Today we're diving into the psychology of self-improvement. That's what we do on the podcast. And this episode is how to build unstoppable motivation and resilience. And now time for a quick advert break. As I said, my questions came from a, frankly, awful week of hiking with my friend Jamie Lloyd, and he will actually be on the show in the future to talk about his lessons. But today we're diving specifically into the psychology of building a stronger mindset and unstoppable motivation by looking into the science. We're mainly going to look at the work of Professor Kenan Sheldon from the University of Missouri, who actually studied long-distance hikers and their motivations to build some lessons for us all on how to build motivations that last. Professor Sheldon does really stand at the forefront of research delving into the nuances of human motivation, and I think the study is really fascinating. He looked at people who were hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, a 2,650-mile journey across America's challenging landscapes, from the arid Mexican border all the way through Washington's rugged mountains up to the border in Canada. It's an expedition that would test anyone and takes at least 5 months to complete. So over that time, there are definitely going to be low moments, a loss of intrinsic motivation and just generic willpower. And that's why Sheldon chose it as a place to study. For some background in psychology, by about the year 2000, it was widely accepted that motivation is either intrinsic motivation, that means driven by internal enjoyment, or extrinsic motivation, that means driven by external rewards like financial gain or recognition. And studies consistently showed that intrinsic motivation is better. It leads to more effective and satisfying engagement in tasks, whilst extrinsic rewards can just diminish the desire to perform a task for its own sake. You don't do it for the love of doing it. You do it because if you have to, and it's actually more of a chore. And studies in psychology have even shown that when you pay people to do a task that they would have just done anyway, they'll actually be less likely to do it because they then purely rely on that payment to ever feel interested to go and do the thing, which is why sometimes it's good to do your art or your passion as just a purely side passion project rather than try and make it your job. Sometimes. Anyway, the prevailing view was that intrinsic motivation is really good and that extrinsic motivation is detrimental to us. Yet, Sheldon sensed that there should just be a more complex picture than this simplistic view. He thought about the instances in our lives where external motivation will have an effect on our lives. So let's consider a student. We'll call him Jimmy. He's preparing for his exams. He doesn't enjoy studying. Sure, he might well be a good student and enjoys finding things out, but studying itself for the sake of studying isn't inherently enjoyable. His motivation is not intrinsic. Instead, that means he's driven by other factors. So how is he motivating himself? Here are a few ideas. Option A, he's studying due to the pressure of his parents, fearing punishment if he fails. Or option B, he's studying out of some guilt, acknowledging that his parents have sacrificed for him, for his education, and that they're actually going to rely on him in the future, and he feels obliged to succeed. Option C, he's studying actually just for his own personal broader goals, like qualifying for future courses, university, and eventually pursuing a career in engineering or medicine. This effort in the moment is not enjoyable in itself, but it does align with his personal ambitions. So all of these scenarios are actually extrinsically motivated in different ways, because Jimmy is not studying for just the sheer joy of studying, but each of them represents a different sort of mindset. Particularly option C, where he's still studying to try and achieve his broader goals. That could be seen as a positive form of motivation for him, because Jimmy is working towards meaningful personal goals despite the lack of inherent pleasure in the task. So this example highlights that not all extrinsic motivation is completely counterproductive, and often we'll engage in tasks that we don't enjoy, and of course even our enjoyable tasks over time can encounter periods of hardship where it's not enjoyable every single moment. And during those times, it's not always helpful to be told that enjoyment alone can fuel our perseverance and enjoyment is where we'll be resilient. So that brings us back to Sheldon's interest in the Pacific Crest Trail hikers. He expected that intrinsic motivation would, of course, inevitably dip during such an arduous journey, which it did. Trust me. And it certainly dipped for me on just my week in Scotland, let alone my friend's entire year across Scotland. And actually, fun fact, a lot of people that hike the entire coast of the UK, which isn't that many people, but most of them skip the west coast of Scotland because it's just so bloody difficult. And very demotivating when you're just constantly going back and forth and like geographically you've basically gone zero distance and it feels like you're going nowhere. And yet you've had like the hardest day of your life to like basically achieve nothing. Anyway, the point is the motivation suffers during these times. So Professor Sheldon asked, what is driving people to continue? His 2018 study gathered 92 different enthusiasts starting the PCT trail, all with varying hiking experiences, and he examined their motivations by asking them a series of questions of why they were doing it, what they expected, etc. So he'd ask them like a form of, I'm hiking the Pacific Crest Trail because A, I find it interesting. B, it's personally important to me. C, I aim to feel proud of myself. D, I would feel like a failure if I didn't complete it and I want to do something difficult. E, important people will think highly of me if I finish. And after E comes F. F, honestly, I don't know why I'm hiking it at all. And as expected from this questionnaire, intrinsic motivation among hikers declined during their journey. But that was fine because Sheldon's interest lay in the types of extrinsic motivation that they would be relying on when their intrinsic motivation faded. And actually, the year before the study, in 2017, researchers had started reorganizing the different distinct forms of motivation that exist. Instead of just the two, intrinsic and extrinsic, they instead created four. And it was no longer a binary intrinsic or extrinsic, but a scale that started on purely intrinsic on the left and went across an array called the relative autonomy continuum all the way to external motivation. So on external motivation, as we know, driven by desire for approval and recognition from others. But then next to that, you have introjected motivation, which means driven by internal pressure and guilt. Then as you start getting closer to intrinsic, you have identified motivation, and that means driven by goals and values that one personally identifies with, even if the activity itself isn't inherently enjoyable. And then lastly, you have intrinsic motivation, which is of course driven by the pure enjoyment of an activity. As we know, external motivation is the least autonomous. It's governed purely by external forces rather than any internal desires. And then, whilst still slightly extrinsically motivated, the identified motivation contrasts heavily with pure extrinsic motivation because identified motivation is aligned with personal values and choices. And whilst we're talking about introjected motivation and identified motivation, I think it's probably worth giving a better word for these. So a more instantly understandable term for introjected motivation could be internalized pressure motivation. And that term, I think, captures the essence of being driven by internal pressures such as guilt, obligation, or a desire to uphold your self-esteem rather than relying on intrinsic enjoyment or personal values. It suggests a motivation that comes from internalizing external expectations or standards, which I think is the point of the term introjected motivation. But whenever I hear that term, it doesn't mean anything to me. So we're going to use internalized pressure motivation. And then when it comes to identified motivation, I think it's more relatable to say value-driven motivation. And that term clearly conveys that the idea for the motivation comes from activities or goals that are in line with an individual's personal values and deeply held beliefs. It emphasizes that actions are driven by what the individual truly values and finds meaningful rather than external rewards or pressures. So value-driven motivation is the same as identified motivation. Cool. So some fun science for you there. Back to Sheldon and his analysis. It revealed that hikers who relied on introjected and identified motivation were more likely to complete the trail. So that's the internalized pressure motivation and the value-driven motivation. By utilizing these forms of motivation to sustain progress, they were less likely to give up when their intrinsic motivation failed. During the entire hike, he also assessed the hiker's mood using the subjective well-being tests, or SWB tests. And he found that only the identified, that means the value-driven motivation, correlated with greater happiness. That means that these hikers, by aligning their actions with personal values, not only completed the trail, but also experienced a higher sense of fulfillment. And of course, whenever we do something, we want to feel more fulfilled and enjoy it more. And that means we're much likely to suffer from burnout, etc. So the study offers insights into how to avoid burnout or misalignment burnout, which occurs when our efforts do not resonate with our true selves, which is why people thought we needed intrinsic motivation in the first place, because it should identify with yourself. So we find that acting more authentically and driven by intrinsic and identified motivation aligns our actions with our identity and fosters a sense of purpose and satisfaction. And certainly my friend that hiked the entire coast of the UK, he was also doing that to raise money for mental health and the charity Mind, which is definitely an extrinsic factor, but it very much was part of his identified value-driven motivation because of he cares about mental health and he was really enjoying talking to other people and spreading the message of mental health. So to then create take-homes for ourselves and actionable insights besides just understanding what are the things that work is how do we build the things that work? How can we foster more intrinsic and more identified motivation in our lives? That's how we can create the unstoppable motivation rather than just understanding which motivation is wrong or right. Now, actually, a lot has been written already about increasing intrinsic motivation, such as Daniel Pink's Drive, which focuses on autonomy, competence, and purpose. Less attention was given to how to enhance the identified value-driven motivation. The key here lies in identifying what truly matters to you and aligning your actions. And that concept actually is crucial for fostering a growth mindset because you're much more likely to dig deeper and adopt a mindset willing to take the harder path in growth rather than the easy options. So number one is identifying personal values, which might sound super easy, like we know what our values are, but we often really don't. And I think we can learn a lot by introspecting on different forms of time horizons. I've done podcasts already on things like thinking 30 years ahead and what we really want in the long term, and actually how to be more present in the short term, etc. But here are a few nice ideas of how to go along the different sorts of time horizons that we should utilize to really find our true personal values. So let's start with long-term aspirations. A really cool method is called the Eulogy method, which basically means reflecting on how you want to be remembered at your funeral. And actually, when you do this, it's really nice. People don't exactly want to be remembered for the fact they had a nice house and a fast car. They probably want to be remembered for the fact that they were like a really helpful person that was going to be kind and was there for them in times of trouble. And so on the surface, it might sound a bit morbid talking about your death. It's actually worth beginning with the end in mind and specifically your funeral. Ask yourself, what would I feel good about someone saying in my eulogy? Think what you'd like a family member, a close friend, or even a distant relative or coworker to say at your funeral. Whether that's like standing up to make a speech or just like in the chat afterwards where people like reflect a bit about why they liked you or thought you were an idiot, etc. And this method helps us to really understand the question of what do I value and to think about that from other people's perspective. Because at your funeral, even your co-workers are going to be unlikely to say, oh, he helped us close lots of $1 million deals. They're going to talk about you as a person, your relationships, your character, your hobbies. They talk about your positive impact in general on the world and themselves, rather than like how much money you are making. And now try and apply that to what you've learned to your life today. And what does the life you want people to remember you for in a few decades mean for the life that you should be building now? I'm sure you can't wait to hear what I'm about to say next, but we're going to have a very quick pause for an advert so that I can continue working on the show and making these things for you. So now we've thought of really long term, like the end of your life. Let's go a bit closer to home and think about more like the story of your life, the medium term. And there's a really cool technique called the Odyssey plan to explore different life paths you could take over the next 5 years. It was a great exercise from the Design Your Life course run at the Stanford Business School. And it basically asks one simple question of what do you want your life to look like in 5 years' time? But instead of going straight in at face value, you need to try approaching it from like a few different perspectives and angles. So you'll start with like your current path and you write out in very specific detail what your life would look like 5 years from now if you continue doing your current path. Like you stay in the job that you're doing, you kind of go for promotions or whatever, or at least staying in the general career path, education path that you're doing. Then you look at your alternative path and you write out again in detail, what would your life look like in 5 years' time if you took like a completely different path? You changed career, you maybe tried living in a different country, etc. Some big changes, but perhaps some things that you have also been interested in. Maybe you've always wanted to be doing some journalism. Maybe you've always wanted to work in the charity sector or be a surgeon, who knows? And then you go even crazier. Number 3 is your radical path. And this is where you write out, again, in very specific detail, what your life would look like 5 years from now if you took a completely different path, where you think about like your current relationship with money, your social obligation, and you imagine that whatever society says is important to you doesn't matter. All of these expectations we have from life are irrelevant. And you just go absolutely crazy with like what you might do if none of these things mattered. And you write out the radical life path. And this one's epic. And by doing this whole exercise, gives you a realization that you are not stuck on your current path. There are many other things you can do, because even on the radical one, often the things that you end up doing are still completely possible. There are people in the world probably making some of those choices, and it releases you from the expectations of what you feel you have to do or must do just because you're already doing it, and allows you to think a lot more holistically and open-mindedly about what you might do and see which ideas actually excite you and tap into that identified value-driven motivation. And then finally, to get much more short-term, there's another exercise called the Wheel of Life exercise that will help you assess how your current actions resonate with your values in various life areas. This mainly means your health, work, and relationships. So with number 1 areas like health, your body, your mind, your soul, mental health, etc. Number 2, your work. That means the general mission that you're working towards, the type of money you make, the type of growth opportunities you have in your work, and perhaps the impact. And number 3, relationships like your family, your romantic life, your friends, looking at your relationships in your current life. What you do is you go through this wheel of life and you rate how aligned you feel in each of these 3 areas of your life. You ask yourself, to what extent do I feel like my current actions are aligned with my personal values? And if you want to be even more visual, you can start coloring in the segments accordingly. If you're feeling very fulfilled, you fill in the segment entirely. If you feel completely unfulfilled, you leave it blank. It's a very visual reminder of like the emptiness you feel in that area. Of course, you can instead just rate it 0 to 10, with 0 being misaligned, 10 being completely aligned. But the visual one is nice. Either way, in just a few minutes, you've been able to do an audit of your life and identify the areas in which you think that you're currently taking actions that align you with how you want to live your life and where you're going, and the areas in which your actions currently don't take you in the places you want to go, and what you might need to do to make that area feel more complete and nourished. And again, this exercise is epic. So putting all of these 3 exercises together really helps you look at the present, the midterm, and like your overall life, to understand like what your real values are for your life and what are the sort of things you should be working on to actually meet your values. And this introspection is actually vital for nurturing a growth mindset, because it encourages the flexibility, the learning and adaptability that you might need to do things that would align more with your true values. And now that we've gone through the first exercise of like working out our personal values, the second exercise is, of course, understandably, aligning your actions with your values. So now that you've identified your core personal values, next step is look at your daily actions and align these actions with the things that you value, which annoyingly means like do the things you care about, but it also means working out how to align how you think about your actions to make them appear more like the things that you do care about. Because, for instance, if physical fitness aligns with your overall values for your life, which like for most people it actually does, so they do want to be physically healthy and mentally healthy, but that then means changing your view about exercise and not seeing it as a chore, but as a crucial part of your valued lifestyle, because it is actually something you care about and you've identified the intrinsic motivation for it rather than trying to rely on willpower or completely extrinsic motivational rewards, etc. Another example might be that if you procrastinate on your work projects, then you could reflect on how that task really fits into your broader career goals. Just like the student studying for their exams, you could tell yourself that completing the project isn't actually just about meeting a deadline. It's another step towards mastering your craft, contributing to the field that you're passionate about. And then by framing the task in the context of your bigger professional aspirations, your values, and your goals, you'll transform the maybe more mundane obligation and task into something that is part of a meaningful endeavor that resonates with your personal vision of success. Again, looking at things like saving money that people might struggle with and feel like a chore, instead of viewing it as a restriction on what you're able to do, now you can align it with your true values. You value financial independence, you value security, and you remind yourself that I'm not cutting back on my expenses now. I'm actually working towards my goal of financial freedom, and that will allow me to pursue things that I truly care about without so many monetary constraints. And then it taps into your identified value-driven motivation because of you're doing something for your values, and it helps you reframe how you think about yourself because you are someone that wants financial freedom and you are someone willing to cut back on some expenses right now. And that's growth mindset. That's how we change how we think about ourselves and how we keep motivation to do the difficult things. So these examples have underscored the transformative power of aligning our actions with our values. By turning routine tasks into things that feel more meaningful steps towards a fulfilling life, we can feel much more motivation to do these tasks. This alignment process fosters a growth mindset by encouraging you to view any challenges as opportunities for development, and it aligns your efforts with a deeper sense of purpose. It's not about pushing through the task for external validation or building your own general willpower. It's about choosing activities that resonate with your true self and ensuring both productivity and personal satisfaction are the result of this. And just to go a little deeper on a few tips to help you succeed with these two main lessons of identifying your personal values and aligning your actions with your words, here are some ideas you might want to try incorporating, like just taking yourself for a walk and thinking about why your goals are important to you. I know some people that write their goals out like twice a day, which might be a bit excessive, but it is worth finding some kind of way to help you understand and regularly reaffirm why you're doing things. And that can really help reignite your motivation, especially during challenging times. Such as my friend walking the entire coast of Britain for a year, who knew that he was doing this to raise money and awareness for mental health. He had a very clear why the whole time, which is a value-driven, identified motivation, even if it was extrinsic. And now the next point is to try and make sure that we're setting meaningful goals and like regularly setting them. So establishing goals that we have that you know resonate with your personal values and writing them down, because then that's going to tap into your aspirations and like remind yourself of who you want to be and why. These should be goals that do excite you, give you a sense of purpose rather than just being something you feel you should do. And that means, for instance, choosing a career path or a hobby which has goals within it that you're not doing because it's expected of you or because it's prestigious, that these goals have come from you because it's something that does interest you or aligns with some personal values of what you want to do. I mean, if you want to solve climate change, you might have to do a few boring things, and that's fine because it's tapping into your wider identified motivation, even if intrinsically in the given moment you're doing some things that are boring. Number 3 is making sure you regularly incorporate small wins. So don't just have like giant, large goals, but break them down into smaller, manageable tasks that are achievable and celebrating those wins along the way. And that will help provide a sense of progress and achievement It'll reinforce the value of the larger goal when you know that you're making your steps towards it, and regularly remind yourself of this identified motivation. Like, for example, my friend hiking the entire coast, every single day that he made like even 100 meters progress, it's still like a small win because that's one less step he has to take. And even though you're doing something super, super huge, it is a constant sense of progress. And when we do other things in life, I think it can be more confusing. When we're working on like bigger projects, we can kind of get lost in the general lack of clear, long timeline. And so sometimes feels like things are getting worse, or even with our finances, like stocks can go down or we have a few more outgoings, and we don't feel that sense of progress without making these small wins so present to us. But when you're hiking, I think those small wins are very present because it's just so obvious that you've literally made some distance ahead of yourselves. And so I think you really have to like work on making these small wins way more obvious to make it easier for you. And the final last quick tip I have is to seek feedback and reflect on it. So constructive feedback is just so incredibly valuable. It helps you understand how your actions are perceived and what impact they're having. That means talk to people that you work with, talk to your friends, family, a coach, a therapist, whatever, and just take that time to understand what's working, what isn't working, like give yourself feedback on what you think is working, and allow yourself to make mistakes, course correct, to help align your efforts in the long term more closely with your values. And that, of course, taps into growth mindset and personal change and growth. So overall, motivation isn't just extrinsic and extrinsic. There are multiple types, and there's actually something called identified motivation, which is value-driven motivation, even though it might be extrinsic. And we can make a conscious effort to align our actions with things that are genuinely important to us, even when their action isn't intrinsically delightful. And by doing that, we can lead our lives in a direction that is more fulfilling. It has some more meaningful pursuit of our personal value-driven goals. And that alignment is fundamental to nurturing a growth mindset, as it encourages continuous learning, adaptability, and personal development. So there you have it. That is a recipe for unstoppable motivation and real willpower by tapping into the more deeper, longer lasting forms of motivation that exist within us by using a lot of reflection and better planning to actually make these things obvious for us. It's something that we can all do, and I hope that you can take some time to actually think about these things and use them this year going ahead, as I'm sure you have lots of big ideas of cool things that you want to do, and I want this to help you. And on that, thank you so much for listening. On my own personal journey, I am trying to grow the podcast and make this my main thing for the year, as I've loved doing this for the past 6 years and figured that why should I be doing anything else? Because if this is my favorite and most useful thing that I do for the world, why not do it way better and more? So if you can help me by giving me a good rating on Apple, YouTube, or Spotify, that would be delightful. And you, of course, can also help me by giving me some feedback. That can come in the form of a comment on Spotify or YouTube, or sending me an email at growthmindsetpodcast@gmail.com. And I will be super thankful. I will be super grateful and always happy to connect with listeners. So thanks again for listening. Remember that life is to be enjoyed, so try using some of the exercises from today to align your personal values better. Also remember that life is lived in the present now, so you do really want to be working on these things. And of course, as always, be kind to yourself, and whilst you're at it, be kind to someone else too. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
Studies show we need time for information to sink in, so I'm going to give you a 5-second pause, silence, to reflect on one idea from the show before you jump back into your busy life. Ready and go.